Hello, Professor Race here to talk about handling quotations in papers, specifically MLA papers. The information contained in this lesson is available in a handout called Handout on Quoting and Paraphrasing, available in your Blackboard course. So take a look for that. Quoting is a word-for-word, exact representation of somebody else's thought or ideas that is enclosed in quotation marks. And the key here is it has to match the source document word for word. Another important thing to remember about quoting is we have to attribute all quotations to a source. You cannot just drop a quotation into a paragraph. You need to tell your reader who it is you're quoting and where it came from. This source must also be listed on a works cited page as well. Okay, we've got to be really careful to avoid dropping quotations into our paragraphs without warning. So we have to provide clear signal phrases or signal sentences in our own words to introduce any quoted material. A signal phrase or sentence can also show readers how a quotation supports the point that you are making. Readers shouldn't have to guess why a quotation shows up in your paper, so you should also follow any quotation with interpretive comments that explain the point that the quotation is illustrating. Don't expect the reader to just be able to deduct for himself the point that you are trying to get across. You need to explain to the reader what you want him or her to get out of the quotation that you are using. Now a little bit on punctuation. A signal phrase is not a complete sentence, so we follow it with a comma. Here's a signal phrase introducing a quotation. The narrator states. So we use a comma after that. A signal sentence is followed by a colon. So look at this longer signal sentence. The narrator explains the grandmother's desire to dress in nice clothes for the trip. That is followed by a colon since it is a signal sentence. Now, a word about verbs used in signal phrases and sentences. When we're writing about literature, we can choose a variety of introductory verbs. We need to use them in the present tense to signal that we are about to quote the words of someone. Here's a nice group of some introductory verbs that you can use to introduce quotations, and be sure you use the present tense. Argues, adds, concludes, establishes, explains, disagrees, and so on. Here are some examples. One critic notes, and then your quote, or James Lester suggests, and then your quote. Another option is to integrate a quotation into your own sentence. You do not use a comma before the quotation unless the grammatical structure of the sentence requires it. Also, you will not capitalize the first word of the quotation unless it is a proper noun. Let's read the example here. The grandmother is described as wearing a nice dress and even a corsage for the trip so that, open quotes, in case of an accident, anyone seeing her dead on the highway would know at once that she was a lady, close quotation marks. So notice how smoothly this quotation is integrated into the structure of this sentence. There's no comma needed right here, and the letter I for the word in does not need to be capitalized. That's an example of integrating a quotation into your own sentence. Now, we use MLA format for this course to document anytime we quote or paraphrase or summarize information from another source. So specifically talking about MLA format for quotations. It requires that whenever you incorporate material in your paper that is not your own, you have to provide what we call an in-text citation after it. If the author's name is not used in a signal phrase, then the in-text citation will include the last name of the author and the page number of the source in parentheses at the end of the borrowed material. Let's take a look at an example. Here is the example of the integrated quotation we looked at a moment ago. The grandmother is described as wearing a nice dress and even a corsage for the trip so that, open quotes, in case of an accident, anyone seeing her dead on the highway would know at once that she was a lady. Close quotes. Notice, no period there. We open the parentheses, put the last name of the author from whom this quote is taken, the page number where this quotation appears. We use a closing parentheses, and then the closing period for the entire sentence goes after the in-text citation. Now, if you do mention the author's name in the signal phrase, then your in-text citation will include only the page number of the source in parentheses. So you can see here we actually mention the author's name in the signal phrase. Flannery O'Connor describes the grandmother as wearing a nice dress, and then we continue with a quotation. So since we mention O'Connor's name in the signal phrase, we do not need to repeat her name in the in-text citation. All we have to give is the page number. Once again, notice the sentence period goes after the parentheses on the in-text citation. Now, some sources you will find do not have an author's name available. And if that is the case, then you just use the title of the source in the signal phrase or the in-text citation. So, look at this example. The short story writer Flannery O'Connor's subject has been described as acceptance, the point at which her sinners become aware. Notice what is in parentheses. It's in quotation marks, Mary Flannery O'Connor. This is the title of an article in the Dictionary of Literary Biographies on the web called Contemporary Authors. And it does not have an author or a page number, so all we get is the title to identify it with. Okay, every now and then you may need to use square brackets in a quotation if you need to modify a quoted word to make it fit your sentence. A lot of times we need to change a past tense word to present tense, and so we will put the modified word in square brackets to show that we as the writer have made a change to the original. So here's an example here. For example, Jackie catapults out of the confession box, comma, quotes, hits is in square brackets, hits the door with unmerciful wallop. Hits probably changing from past tense hit to present tense hits. And finds himself instead of probably present tense, and found himself flat on his back in the middle of the aisle. So anytime you need to modify any words, changing especially from past to present tense to fit the context of your sentence, be sure to place that in square brackets to indicate to the reader that is not how it appears in the original quotation. Okay, single quotes and double quotes. As writers of papers, especially about literature, we often find ourselves needing to quote a passage that appears in quotation marks in the original text, especially dialogue. So whenever quotation marks appear in the original passage, change them to single quotes. Then, place double quotation marks at the beginning and the end of the entire passage. Try to make sure that the double and single quotation marks are facing inward toward the quoted text. When the priest meets Jackie for his first confession, he treats him with compassion. "Oh," he said respectfully, "a big hefty fellow like you must have terrible sins." Notice we have our set of double quotation marks to indicate that this is taken from a source, word for word. The single quotation mark here indicates that that appears in quotation marks in the original. the single quote as well. Single quote here, and then closing the whole thing off with a single quote to show that this appeared in quotation marks in the original, and then the double quotes to show that you've taken the whole section from O'Connor's story, page 426. The ellipsis mark. It looks like this: 3 periods with a space in between each. We use the ellipsis mark to indicate we have deleted words from an otherwise word-for-word quotation. Be careful. What is left has to be grammatically incomplete. Here's an example of the use of an ellipsis mark. The misfit remarks about the grandmother that she would have been a good woman, words have been left out, if it had been somebody there to shoot her every minute of her life. Now, if you want to omit one or more full sentences, use a period before the 3 ellipsis dots for a total of 4 dots. In this quotation from the short story, The Chrysanthemums, starting right here, her figure looked blocked and heavy in her gardening costume, a man's black hat pulled low over her eyes, clodhopper shoes, a figured print dress almost completely covered by a big corduroy apron with 4 big pockets. And then we have our ellipsis mark including a period to indicate one or more full sentences have been left out right here. Ordinarily, do not use the ellipsis mark at the beginning of a quotation. And then finally, the block quote. The block quote is what we use if a quotation is more than 4 typed lines. What we do is set it off from the text in block form by indenting the entire passage
1/2 inch from the left margin.
You do need to create a signal sentence to lead into the quotation and follow it with the colon. Quotation marks are not used at the beginning or the end of the block quote. Copy all punctuation in the original quote exactly the way it appears in the original. And do not use more than 1 block quote in a paper of about 3 to 5 pages. So do not overuse the block quote. Here's an example. And this right here, this space right here, is supposed to represent 10 spaces, which is roughly equivalent to 1 inch. So notice that we have our signal sentence, not long after Goodman Brown enters the forest, he meets his companion, and this right here is our block quote. Notice no quotation marks are used at the beginning or the end of the block quote. The period happens right here, this time before the in-text citation with the author's last name and the page number. And that's it. Good luck with handling quotations in your papers.